Ron is speaking, that's probably the nicest introduction I've ever gotten. Kind of pressure's kind of on. I love stories. I love all kinds of stories. I love books, I love movies. I'm embarrassed to say there are 3 DVRs in my house. I love music. If you listen to music, right, songs or lyrics or stories. But my favorite stories by far are hearing people's stories. I love to hear people's stories. And for whatever reason, people are very open to telling me their story, which is good because I like to hear them. I get to travel a lot for business, and I'm a very extroverted person. I don't like to be by myself. And when I'm traveling alone, one of the worst things for me personally is having to eat alone. So if I'm traveling, I typically will not sit at a table. I'll sit at the bar because, quite honestly, there's a captive audience. You know, there's a bartender there that can engage with her. What I've found is that other people as well will, if they're by themselves and sitting at the bar, they're open to conversations. And this recently happened, actually just 2 weeks ago today. I was in the Philippines for work, and I was scoping out this Irish pub to see if they'd be playing the Steelers game later on that night. They weren't. But I met this lady, Margaret, and she was just a hoot, and my mother-in-law's name is Margaret. I thought it'd be kind of cool if she would say hello to her in a video, so I want to introduce you to Margaret.
Hi Margaret, I'm Margaret from Nottingham in the UK, living in the Philippines, and I've just met Neil, another American. He's been a good boy, I'll keep my eye on him.
Isn't that cute? I didn't realize in the service how huge my head is in this shot. It's unbelievable. That shot, that clip, the timestamp on that is 4:30 in the afternoon. At 4:40, I took another video because I have no idea how we got there. But we got into this conversation. She just starts telling me her family history, and it was fascinating. So I stopped her. I'm like, oh my gosh, my father-in-law would love this. He's into that Ancestry.com and all searching his roots and stuff. So I videoed it. But so I wanted to show you that just a portion of our conversation. There it is.
My family, my daughter's on the family tree. On my mum's side, we came from Germany in 1701.
What was her maiden?
Orson.
Okay.
That's a German name. We came over to London.
I have Orson in my family, O-R-S-O-N.
O-R-T-Z-E-N. On the dad's side, we came from Normandy in France in 1066.
1066.
And took the British throne.
Sorry. Really?
Honestly and truthfully, we came over. Two of my ancestors was with Richard on the 3rd, 4th and 6th Crusade and finished up in Bristol in France with Richard.
Isn't that something? She really didn't like it. Like, oh, shut up. I think she thought I was serious. And I go, I'm studying the Brits again. Oh, Neil. But stories like that, those interactions, that made my day. I enjoyed it so much. How awesome is it that she's able to share her story so openly with some Yankee from the States? But truth be told, it's a pretty cool story, right? Like, if I had that story, I'd be probably telling it to all kinds of Brits all over the place, but I don't have that kind of story. My story is very different. And regardless of what our story is, we should be, and I think God calls us to be open to telling our story. He uses our stories to reach people. God uses stories all throughout the Bible. Jesus tells stories as parables to teach. So we shouldn't be afraid, but a lot of times I think we get caught up in the path that we've taken and aren't too proud of the path we've taken a lot of times. There's a verse that I love and hate. It's Jeremiah 29:11. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future." And a lot of people look at that verse and it gives them hope. Like, God cares about me. God has a plan for me and He wants to grow me. That's awesome. Then there's people like me that look at that and it scares the life out of them because I'm like, oh my gosh, God has a plan for me. And I know I haven't been following it the majority of my life. So what's that going to look like? You know, the first group of folks, I think when they think of their plan, they think of the road or the path of something like this. Something like this. Long, straight road, right? That, you know, you're following God's will, you follow this, there's this phrase for it, right? Follow the straight and narrow path. And I think a lot of people think that when you're a Christ follower, that's what your path looks like. My path doesn't look anything like this. My path looks more something like this. And each of these corners, if you think of them as decision points in your life. Like when you've had to make critical decisions. Sometimes you're making decisions and you get to that intersection and you choose the right way and you choose God's path. Other times you don't. Sometimes you still go forward. I spend a lot of time going backwards. But regardless, we keep moving forward. We don't like to talk about these times when we fail. We don't like to talk about the relationships that we've destroyed, the marriages that we lost, the addictions that we succumb to, the gossip that we tell, the anger that takes us over. We don't like to talk about those things. But we need to realize that they are part of our story, and God can use that. Like Scott said, I told my story in Nicaragua for the first time ever. I wasn't planning on doing it. I kind of got up and I talked to some folks, and Rob said, he said, you need to tell that story. I'm like, well, why? So why would I be here telling my story? What's so great about my story? Absolutely nothing. My story is just a story, like your story is just a story. But I told them I would. So I'm going to start at the end of my story. Well, I was at the end of the story, but we're up to date now. If you were to look at me now, I think most people that see me, they see a pretty successful person. I've been at my job for 18 years. I've been pretty successful there. I've got a pretty nice house. I've got the most beautiful family. Great family support. I get to travel around the world, both with my job, with missions work. I've got some cool toys. I actually, the drone that took that picture, that's my drone. I got cool toys. But it wasn't always like this. And people kind of look at me and think, oh, it's kind of got it together, you know. But it's really couldn't be farther from the truth. My parents got married very young. My mother was 17, my dad was 19. He was signed up for the Air Force he got his draft number and he knew he was going to get drafted, so rather than get drafted in the Army or the Marines, he decided to join the Air Force. He got stationed in Lakenheath, Heath, England, and so when my mother graduated high school, she went over to be with him. She was very lonely. She didn't, even though my dad was home every night, she didn't have any family, didn't have any friends. So my mother made the decision to go off the pill without telling my father. So surprise, here comes Neil a little bit later. My mom wasn't really able to handle that. She kind of had a breakdown. My family, my grandmother, and then her mom went over to stay, but it just really didn't work out. So after a few years, they shipped my dad and her back stateside to Myrtle Beach so she could be closer to home. The day before my 3rd birthday, my brother Jason was born. And that didn't go very well either. My dad got shipped to Thailand, and one day my mother tried to hurt herself. And my dad was very successful in the Air Force. He was flying through the ranks, pun intended, and Air Force flying through the ranks. First service guy, but he got called in the CO's office, and within 2 hours, he was on a plane back to the States, and within 48 hours, he was kicked out of the Air Force. So my father then becomes homeless and unemployed with 2 children and a wife who's had a mental breakdown. So his family helps him. He puts a 14-foot mobile home on my grandparents' land, and he goes to work for one of his high school friends who opened a masonry business. My dad became a bricklayer. Things didn't go well for my parents, and they ended up getting divorced when I was 6. The first time that I ever went to visit my mom, my brother went with me, and she tells the story of how she didn't know where we were. She opened the room, and she tells the story of my brother sobbing, and me just sitting there holding and rocking him back and forth, telling him, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. He didn't remember her, he didn't know who she was. The next day she sat me down, and she asked me a question that would really alter the course of my life and sort of how I viewed my role in my family going forward. She asked me, She said I had to choose who I wanted to live with. And if that wasn't hard enough for a 6-year-old, she said, and whatever you choose, Jason has to follow. Well, I really wanted to live with my father, but I chose to live with her. My 6-year-old rationale was, well, he's a boy, he's strong, he can handle it. My mom's a girl, she'll cry. So a few weeks later, we went to move with my mom and her boyfriend, who was a musician. They ended up marrying. He was probably one of the greatest men in my life. I still have a relationship with him to this day. That started going well, and then when I was 8, my sister Megan was born. And then things didn't go well again. And he would work nights, and she started drinking a lot heavier. They'd get home and they'd fight all the time, and it culminated in she ended up chasing him around the house with a kitchen knife, so he left. A few days later, she sat me down again and said, hey, you know, you're 9 years old, but you need to step up. You need to take care of your brother and sister. So I did. You know, I would get them up in the morning, get them ready for school, get them breakfast. Jimmy would come and get Megan and take him either to preschool or to his mother's house. And I would walk Jason to school, and I'd wait for him to pick him up, and we'd come home and do our chores. It was just normal. One night, when I'm in bed, and I hear my mother yelling for me, Neil, the jacket doesn't fit. I gotta go to work. The jacket doesn't fit. I'm like, what in the world? So I looked down the stairs to find my mother with no clothes on except for my jacket. Now, I wasn't always this size, so as a 9-year-old, it was a pretty small jacket. And I got her a blanket and put it around her and did my fair best to convince her that she wasn't supposed to be leaving for work because it was 12:30 at night. And I did the only thing I knew to do for somebody that was drunk at the time was make coffee, so I made her a cup of coffee. And I remember her sitting at the table taking a sip of it and seeing a bottle of open pills. And I remember getting really angry at the pills. So I convinced her to go back to bed. And as we were walking down the hall, we went past my sister and my brother's rooms, and I could see them looking like, what's going on? I'm like, it's okay, it'll be okay. Put my mom in bed, I grabbed a pillow from my bed, and then I slept outside her door. My biggest fear was that she was going to get up and try to get out of the house. So this way she would have to, I didn't know. I must have fallen asleep because then I heard a thud on the other side of the door. I tried to open the door and I couldn't open it. So I finally pushed it open and I found my mom. She had collapsed. Her eyes were rolled back in her head. She had overdosed. So I called the ambulance. I called her dad. I called Jimmy to come get Megan. And I did the only thing I knew to do. I got my brother and my sister ready for school. As I can still remember sitting across the living room from them as they were wheeling my mom out on the stretcher. They were ready, they're sitting in their jackets, and they're sitting on the edge of the couch. For whatever reason, the thing that struck me was that they were so little, their feet didn't hit the floor, and they were just kind of dangling. And they were just looking at me like, okay, what's next? Then the strangest thing happened, everybody left. Like the police left, the ambulance left, and left me with Jason and Megan. Within a few minutes, my grandfather showed up, my stepfather showed up. He took Megan and dropped us off at school. We came home that night, and my Aunt April, my mother's sister, was there. My dad, my stepfather, and my grandfather, my dad's dad. And they were packing our things. And we left, but we all went separate. What I didn't know was this would be the last time I had ever lived with my brother and sister again. Sorry. So I went to live with my aunt, and that was really hard. I convinced them to let me go live with my dad, and I did. But I was pretty independent. So I was probably 12 or 13 when I was 6th grade. So however you are in 6th grade. And but he worked 3 to midnight, so I didn't get home till 3:30. So I kind of just took care of myself. I got a job when I was a freshman in high school, and I realized that there was a common denominator in most of my problems in my life. It happened to be my mother. So I decided that I was going to try and distance myself from her as much as possible. This really upset my whole family. She got sick with diabetes or something, and they blamed me. They said it was the stress. So I found an escape by becoming a foreign exchange student. I spent my junior year of high school in Ecuador. So Although I knew it was not my fault what was going on with my mom, I said, I figured, I'm gonna be gone for a year. What's the harm of going to visit her a few times? So I went and visited her, and things were actually going pretty well. Her new husband, her third husband now, they started a business. They just bought a house. I just remember thinking, hey, things are pretty good. Everybody's doing all right. It was about a few weeks before I left for Ecuador, and I was painting the skirting on my dad's trailer, just to help him out. And the phone rang, and it was my grandmother. And she said, Neil, you need to get to the hospital. Joe beat your mother pretty bad. So Joe's her husband. So I went to the hospital. I remember getting off the elevator, and I came around the corner, and there's like a waiting area, and I see my Aunt April there, the aunt that I live with. And I looked at it, it's like, you see somebody out of context you don't expect to see, so it's kind of surprised. So I smiled, like, oh, Aunt April. And her face just kind of sunk, and her eyes got big, and she covered her mouth. And then she was talking to this lady who was just a mess. And I'm like, gosh, I wonder what that is. And she turned, and it was my mother. They had gotten up that morning, or the morning before rather, and to celebrate their house by having Bloody Marys. And they proceeded to polish off 2 bottles by about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They convinced their neighbor to take them to get a picnic table. On the way back, they got into an argument, she hit him, and the argument carried into the house where however he wound up on top of her, he ripped out 60% of her hair. And he hit her so hard that the entire side of her face crushed in, her eye socket shattered, and her eye slid down to her cheek. And so I saw her, and for the first time in my life, I saw what shame looked like. And I didn't know why she felt that way, but I saw it, and it rocked me. And as bad as that was, there was a silver lining. She realized she had a problem. So she finally admitted that there was a problem that she needed to address. So they got her into the best rehab facility in the state of Pennsylvania. The problem was she had to wait 30 days for a bed. So she went to live with my aunt, the same man I went to live with. And I was thinking, okay, this is all right. I'm gonna be able to leave and things will be fine. About 2 weeks later, she calls me. And I'm talking to her, and I hear this voice in the background. It's her husband. I said, where are you? He says, I'm home. I said, what are you doing? I said, you're supposed to be going to the hospital. She's like, I don't need that. That's for alcoholics. That's not for me. That was one of the last conversations I ever had with my mother. I went to Ecuador, wildly successful, best year of my life. Graduated high school, got into the college that I wanted, went to school, joined a fraternity, did all the things that you do in a fraternity that definitely aren't part of God's path. A lot of things that I'm embarrassed about now, but they're still part of my story. But I realized that if I kept going down that path, things weren't going to wind up well for me. So I joined the Marine Corps. I was in the Marine Corps for 6 years and really kind of got on a good path, had a good life. Met my daughter's mother, my first wife, moved to Virginia. Things were going really well. Hope was born. And I was about 2 years old. And I was in the living room, and her mom asked me a question. She said, do you believe in Jesus? I took 6 years for this to come up. Been married for 2 years. I said, well, yeah, I believe Jesus was a person. You're probably a good teacher, a good guy. But I don't think he was God. As a matter of fact, I don't think there is a God. Because there would never be a God that would allow me and my family to go through what we went through. How could I couldn't rationalize the two. So that scared her quite a bit. See, I had grown up Catholic. We'd go to Mass on Easter and Christmas, but not a lot of spirituality in our family. My grandmother's very religious. But when I was 9, something happened that really influenced me to a great degree. If any of you grown up Catholic or non-Catholics, you know what CCD class is. It's a class that you take before you take your first Holy Communion. And I went through the class, and it was the Sunday I was getting my first Holy Communion. I was really confused about a lot of stuff, because a lot of it just didn't stick with me. So we were walking across the street, and I asked my mom, let me get this straight. So Adam named all the animals, right? She's like, yeah. I said, well, what about the dinosaurs? And her eyes got big. She had no idea how to answer. Just at that time, from across the street, the priest was walking across the street. The parish house was across the street from the church. So he's walking across. He's like, "Father Mick, Irish something or other, can you come here? Neil has a question for you." So I asked him a question. He's like, "Well, Neil, let me explain this. See, they didn't have the science that we had back in those days. So they didn't understand a lot of things. So what they did was they made up stories and they put them in the Bible to explain things that they didn't understand. Very plausible, feasible, logical explanation. Oh, okay, so it's a bunch of made up stories to explain things. Well, that'll kind of wreck your faith if you don't have a foundation. We use the Bible as our foundation of our faith, but if it's not real, it kind of messes you up for quite a while. It messed me up for 20 years. But I would always get into these religious conversations, and I was very much a seeker. I was very afraid of what would happen to me when I died. But so we started going to all these churches. So Amy was freaking out because I didn't believe Jesus was a person. I didn't believe in God. And we have a daughter. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So long story short, we ended up going to this church that she had found. It was a contemporary church over here. They met in Springfield Elementary School. And contemporary band, it was good. And I went to this class called Alpha. See, I had studied, I really wanted to know God. So I had studied Scientology, I had studied Hinduism, Buddhism, Mormonism. If there was an ism, I studied it. But nothing has stuck. There was nothing, I couldn't find the foundation. So I took this Alpha course, and after second class was about the Bible, and how the Bible is actually real, and how the Bible came to be, and that's the foundation of our faith. And that was attractive to me. I'm like, oh, okay, so it's not just a science book. The third class, and then for whatever reason, the thing that got me to believe wasn't that Jesus rose again. I knew that, but I didn't know that he lived for 40 days. And for some, and the one thing that really got me was that he ate with people. And I don't know why, but that was what God used to get into my head, like, hey, I am real. So one Sunday morning, the band did something they never did. They came back at the end of the service to play a song, and I accepted Christ. And I didn't hear audible words, and I didn't have this like super natural experience, but I had this feeling of peace come over me. And I had been living well. I had a great job, a great family, a house, a wife, a daughter. But it was just this feeling of peace. And what I realized was, all the time since I was 5, 6 years old making decisions for my family, I felt like I was the one that had to be in control. I felt like it was me that was making the decision and working through everything. So God said, no, I've been there the whole time. It's okay. Just like I told my brother and sister, it's okay, it'll be okay. He told me it's okay, it'll be okay. It changed my life. I got very involved in the church. I'm not a lukewarm kind of person. I'm either all in or I'm all out. So I jumped in and started working on the media team. I started taking classes, Old Testament surveys, New Testament surveys, all kinds of things. And my faith continued to grow. The same isn't true for my brother and sister. My brother graduated high school, followed my dad's path and joined the Air Force, got married very young, bought a trailer, got kicked out of the Air Force, and then started drinking pretty heavily. My brother's body never tolerated alcohol, so I don't know why he chose this avenue. He'd have one beer and he'd get all these highs, but he started drinking heavily. He developed pancreatitis, and he got chronic pancreatitis, and if you know anything about it, it's extremely painful. His health declined, his attitude declined. He ended up getting divorced from his wife. They had 3 children together. He moves back into the room that he grew up in with my grandmother. And after 5 years of struggling with this, he goes through rehab. And because what would happen is he'd have a flare-up, an attack. He'd go to the hospital. They would get the attack under control. He'd leave the hospital. On the way back, he would pick up liquor or beer, and he'd come home. He'd have another attack. So he'd do this cycle. So he went to rehab. He got out of rehab, and he was in some other support group. And he called me on a Friday night. Brian and I were just leaving a Thai place on Stables Mill. And he called me. He's like, hey, I think I'm going to move out of Grams. I'm only 37 years old. I've got a lot. I still got stuff to live for. I can do things. I'm like, that sounds like a really good idea. So let me think about that for a couple days. I said, I'll call you back. So Monday I called him, he didn't answer. He had a doctor's appointment that day. Tuesday night, in the middle of the night, he got up and went to my father's trailer. My dad was an over-the-road truck driver, so he wasn't home. And he sat on the edge of my dad's bed, got his gun, and ended his life. My sister, she hasn't fared very well either. She got pregnant very young, married the father, and then had an episode where she kind of just went off the deep end and disappeared. Didn't know where she was. She ended up coming back to the area with some guy, where him all the drugs, got arrested, lost her children, still doesn't have the rights to see them. I get to see Megan every once in a while because, well, we talk now more since Jason's death. But I just think about, had I not been a Christ follower, how much of that burden would I have carried? They were my brother and sister. She is my sister. But it's not my burden to carry. You know? God's in control. I am there to help. I will do whatever I can, but I don't own my brother's decision. I don't own my sister's decision. And that's the wonderful thing about your faith and your story. Those roads that go backwards, I can sit down with somebody, I can sit down with somebody that's had a drug addiction, and you know, I can say, I know where you're coming from. I can sit down with somebody that's done a lot of things. And I can relate because I have a past. I'm not proud of it, but I wouldn't change it because that's my story. And that's the story that God uses. And I hope He uses yours. And we're going to talk about Joe Groups this week, about people's stories. My story isn't anything great. Not a big deal. There are a lot of people in this room that have a tougher story or a different story. And even if you don't think you do, God uses every one of us. And I just encourage you. The Pattons were here first service, and they're good friends of ours. And Sandy said, I don't think I've ever heard your whole story before. I'm like, well, you didn't. I've never told it. So this is now the second time I've told it. I hope in some way it encourages you to see where God has been in your life and how you can influence people through the story that you have. Every week at Velocity, we get to experience